The envelope was thick, embossed with gold lettering that caught the light as I turned it over in my hands. My best friend Daniel was getting married. The man who had stood by my side through thick and thin, who had been there when I met Sarah, the woman who would later become my wife. Daniel and I had always shared everything, our dreams, our struggles, and now apparently this invitation to his wedding was meant to be one of those shared moments too. Sarah was excited when I showed her the invite. She loved weddings, the whole spectacle of it. I caught her studying the guest list a little too carefully, her eyes lingering on certain names, but I didn't think much of it. After all, she was meticulous by nature, always double-checking details, ensuring everything was perfect. The wedding was set for a weekend in September at a grand estate in the countryside, a place with sprawling gardens and a main house that looked like it belonged in a different century. Daniel had spared no expense, wanting the day to be unforgettable. I'd never seen him so happy, his voice crackling with joy whenever he called to update me on the latest plans. Sarah and I arrived the night before, the air cool and crisp with the promise of autumn. The estate was even more beautiful than I had imagined, its stone walls bathed in the soft glow of lanterns. We checked into our room, a quaint suite with a view of the gardens, and I couldn't help but feel a wave of contentment wash over me. This was going to be a perfect weekend. We met Daniel and his fiancée Jessica for dinner that evening, along with a few other close friends. There was laughter, wine, and the kind of easy conversation that only comes from years of friendship. I noticed Sarah was quieter than usual, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. When I asked her about it later, she brushed it off, saying she was just tired from the drive. That night, as we lay in bed, I wrapped my arm around her, feeling the warmth of her body against mine. I told her how much I loved her, how lucky I felt to have her by my side. She turned to face me, her expression soft, and kissed me gently on the lips. "I love you too," she whispered. But there was something in her voice, a hesitation, a weight that I couldn't quite place. I pushed the thought away, attributing it to the pre-wedding jitters that seemed to affect everyone in some way. Tomorrow would be a big day, and I was determined to enjoy it. After all, it was Daniel's wedding, and nothing was going to ruin it for him, or so I thought. The morning of the wedding broke clear and bright, with sunlight streaming through the tall windows of our suite. Sarah had already left to join the bridal party, leaving me to prepare in solitude. I took my time, adjusting my tie and studying the reflection in the mirror. Today wasn't about me, it was about Daniel. I was determined to be the rock he needed on this big day. Stepping outside, I was greeted by the sight of the estate in full bloom. The gardens were immaculate, with roses and lilies lining the winding paths that led to a grand gazebo where the ceremony would take place. Guests were beginning to gather, their murmurs of excitement blending with the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. I found Daniel in the midst of the groomsmen, his usually steady hands betraying a slight tremor. We exchanged a few words, the kind of easy banter we'd always shared, but beneath it I could sense his nerves. The wedding coordinator soon appeared, her voice brisk as she called us to take our places. The ceremony began as guests settled into their seats. Jessica emerged at the end of the aisle, her dress a masterpiece of lace and satin that shimmered under the morning sun. Daniel's eyes glistened with emotion as she walked toward him, each step measured, carrying her closer to their future. I glanced over at Sarah standing among the bridesmaids. She was breathtaking, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders, the soft fabric of her dress hugging her in all the right places. But there was something off. Her eyes weren't on the bride, they were distant, searching the crowd or lost in some private thought. The vows were exchanged quickly, a blend of tradition and heartfelt promises. Daniel's voice cracked as he slipped the ring onto Jessica's finger, and the crowd responded with applause as the newlyweds kissed. I clapped along with everyone else, but a growing unease was settling in my chest, heavier with each passing moment. As the ceremony concluded, I looked back at the bridesmaids, but Sarah was gone. She had disappeared, slipping away unnoticed. While the guests began to drift toward the reception area, I decided to find her. I moved through the gardens, the sounds of celebration fading behind me as I ventured toward the more secluded parts of the estate. I called her name, but the only response was the rustle of leaves and the distant laughter from the party. And then I saw them. Sarah stood beneath a sprawling oak tree, her figure partially obscured by shadows. She wasn't alone. Richard Drake was with her, standing closer than necessary. He was a man I recognized, a successful businessman with a reputation for getting what he wanted. What bothered me now was how his hand brushed against Sarah's cheek, how she tilted her head just so, allowing him to whisper something in her ear. My breath caught in my throat. I stepped back, the darkness of the garden swallowing me up as I watched them, unseen. Richard's hand lingered on her, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. She didn't move away. Instead, she smiled a smile I hadn't seen in a long time. A cold dread settled over me, each beat of my heart echoing the growing suspicion in my mind. I didn't want to believe what I was seeing, but the scene before me left little room for doubt. I backed away, letting the shadows cover me as I retreated, my mind racing with questions I wasn't ready to answer. The reception was in full swing by the time I returned to the crowd. Music floated through the air, mixing with the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses. Tables were draped in white linens, adorned with flowers that matched the bride's bouquet. I forced myself to join in, to slip back into the role of the supportive friend, but my mind was elsewhere, still replaying what I had seen in the garden. Sarah reappeared shortly after, her face glowing as she moved through the guests with ease. If I hadn't witnessed her exchange with Richard, I would have believed nothing was amiss. She greeted me with a smile, pressing a glass of champagne into my hand, as if everything was perfectly normal. "Where'd you disappear?" I asked, keeping my tone light. "Just needed a breath of fresh air," she replied, her eyes avoiding mine. "You know how these things can get overwhelming." I nodded, but the words felt hollow. There was a distance between us now, a chasm that hadn't been there before. I watched as she moved on, laughing and chatting with other guests, effortlessly blending into the festivities. But I couldn't shake the image of her and Richard, the way they stood together, too close for comfort. I caught glimpses of him throughout the evening, always on the periphery, always watching. He was smooth, never staying in one place too long, but his gaze returned to Sarah with unsettling frequency. As the night wore on, I kept my distance, observing from the sidelines. The toasts were given, Daniel and Jessica beaming as their friends and family spoke of love and happiness. I raised my glass along with everyone else, but the words barely registered. My focus was on Sarah, trying to decipher every glance, every smile, every interaction. At one point, I noticed her slip away again, this time heading toward the back of the hall. I waited a moment, then followed, keeping my steps quiet, blending into the background like a shadow. The hallway was dimly lit, a stark contrast to the lively reception. I moved quickly, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The sounds of the party faded as I reached a side door that led out to a small courtyard. I paused, hearing low voices just beyond the door, and slowly pushed it open. Sarah and Richard were standing close, their faces illuminated by the soft light from a nearby lantern. She had her back to me, but I could see the tension in her posture, the way she leaned in as Richard spoke. His hand rested on her waist, fingers lightly tracing the fabric of her dress. "I can't keep doing this," I heard Sarah say, her voice strained, barely above a whisper. "He's going to find out." Richard's response was too quiet to hear, but the tone was calm, confident. He was the one in control, and it was clear Sarah was struggling, caught between whatever this was and the life we shared. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest, a mix of anger and disbelief surging through me. This wasn't just a moment of weakness, this was something more, something that had been building for who knows how long. I didn't confront them, not yet. Instead, I turned and walked away, my mind racing as I headed back to the reception. The sounds of the party grew louder as I re-entered the hall, but they barely registered. I was too lost in thought, too focused on what I had just witnessed. Sarah returned a few minutes later, slipping back into the crowd as if nothing had happened. She found me at our table, smiling as she took her seat beside me. "You okay?" she asked, placing a hand on my arm. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just tired. It's been a long day." She squeezed my arm, her touch familiar but now tinged with a sense of betrayal. "We can head up soon if you want." I agreed, but my mind was far from any thoughts of rest. I needed to figure out what to do next, how to confront the truth that was now staring me in the face. The evening wore on, but the sense of dread only grew stronger. Whatever Sarah and Richard had, it wasn't going to stay hidden for much longer, and when it came out, everything would change. The reception wound down as the night deepened, guests filtering out in pairs and small groups, their laughter and chatter growing softer as they made their way back to their rooms. Sarah was quiet beside me, her hand resting lightly on my arm as we followed the last of the stragglers up to the main house. It was late, but sleep was the furthest thing from my mind. Inside our suite, Sarah kicked off her heels and started unpinning her hair, the casual way she moved almost mocking in its normalcy. I watched her from across the room, leaning against the door frame, my mind churning with the weight of everything I'd seen and heard. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "Who is he, Sarah?" My voice was low, steady, each word measured. "What's going on with you and Richard?" She froze, her fingers still tangled in her hair, and turned to look at me. For a moment she said nothing, just stared, her eyes searching mine, as if trying to gauge how much I knew. "Don't lie to me," I added, my tone hardening. "I saw you with him." Her shoulders sagged and she let out a breath, the kind that carries the weight of secrets long kept. "It's not what you think," she began, but I cut her off. "Then tell me what it is, Sarah. Because from where I'm standing it looks exactly like what I think. You've been sneaking around with him, haven't you? Behind my back." She looked away, her gaze dropping to the floor, as if it held the answers she was struggling to find. "We've been talking, that's all. It's just, I don't know, I didn't mean for it to get this far." I felt a flash of anger, hot and sharp. "Talking? You were more than just talking out there tonight, Sarah. This isn't some harmless conversation. How long has this been going on?" She hesitated, and that brief pause told me everything I needed to know. A few months, she finally admitted, her voice barely audible. "It started out as nothing, just talking. But then what I pressed," my voice rising despite my efforts to keep calm. "You let it become something more. You let him into our life, into our marriage." Tears welled up in her eyes, and she nodded, unable to meet my gaze. "I never wanted to hurt you. I didn't know how to stop it once it started." I clenched my fists, the room suddenly feeling too small, too suffocating. "So you just kept it going, you let it grow into this, whatever this is?" She nodded again, her tears now spilling over, running down her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she whispered, but the words felt empty, meaningless. "Sorry," I repeated, my voice laced with disbelief. "Sorry doesn't cut it, Sarah. Not for this." She wiped at her tears, her movements frantic, desperate. I know, I don't know what to do." I turned away from her, staring out the window at the darkened gardens below. The memory of her and Richard beneath that oak tree played over in my mind, each detail burning into my thoughts. The way she leaned into him, the way he touched her, it was like a knife twisting in my gut. "You should have thought about that before," I muttered, more to myself than to her. She took a step closer, her voice trembling. "Please, just let me explain. I love you, I really do. But things have been so different lately, I didn't know how to talk to you about it." I spun back to face her, my anger flaring again. "So instead of talking to me, you ran to him? That's your excuse?" She flinched at my tone, but didn't back down. "I'm not excusing it. I'm trying to make you understand. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. I never meant for any of this." The room fell into a tense silence, the kind that hangs heavy in the air, thick with words left unsaid. I stared at her, the woman I had loved for so many years, now a stranger standing before me. "You've destroyed everything," I said quietly, the weight of the truth settling in. "Everything we've built together, everything we had. How do you expect me to just move past this?" Her tears came harder now, her face crumpling as she struggled to find the right words. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know how to fix this." I didn't have an answer for her. I wasn't even sure there was one. All I knew was that the woman standing in front of me had betrayed me in a way I never thought possible, and there was no going back from that. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her there alone with her guilt and tears. I needed air, space to think, to process what had just happened. But even as I walked through the darkened halls of the estate, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The night air was cold against my skin as I stepped outside, the estate's stone walls looming behind me. I walked aimlessly, the gravel crunching underfoot, my thoughts a chaotic swirl. Everything felt surreal, like I was trapped in a nightmare that I couldn't wake from. I ended up by the same oak tree where I had seen Sarah and Richard earlier, its massive branches reaching out like dark claws against the night sky. I stared at the spot where they had stood, replaying the scene in my mind. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the way it had all been hidden in plain sight. The lies, the deceit, right under my nose. The anger that had simmered during our confrontation began to boil over again. I balled my fists, knuckles white, as I fought to keep control. What was I supposed to do now? How was I supposed to look at her, let alone share a life with her, knowing what she had done? My thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the gravel. I turned to see Daniel approaching, his expression concerned. He must have sensed something was off. We'd known each other too long for him not to notice. "You all right, man?" he asked, his voice low, careful. I didn't answer right away, struggling to find the words. Finally, I shook my head. "No, not really." He frowned, coming to stand beside me. "What's going on? You look like you've seen a ghost." I let out a bitter laugh, the sound harsh in the quiet night. "I think I just did. Daniel's eyes narrowed, his concern deepening. What are you talking about? I hesitated, but I knew I couldn't keep it from him. He was my best friend, and he deserved to know what was happening, especially since it involved someone who had been part of his life too. I saw Sarah, I began, my voice rough. With Richard, they're involved. For a moment, Daniel just stared at me, as if trying to process what I had just said. Then slowly he shook his head in disbelief. Richard Drake, are you sure? Yeah, I'm sure, I replied, the bitterness creeping back into my tone. Saw it with my own eyes. They've been sneaking around for months, apparently. He cursed under his breath, running a hand through his hair. I can't believe this. Richard, I knew the guy was slimy, but this, I never thought he'd do something like this to you. Yeah, well, he did, and Sarah, she's been lying to me this whole time. The weight of the betrayal hit me again, my chest tightening with the force of it. Daniel looked at me, his expression one of mixed anger and sympathy. What are you going to do? I shrugged, the motion heavy with defeat. I don't know, I confronted her about it, but it's like everything I thought I knew is just gone. He was silent for a moment, then placed a hand on my shoulder. Whatever you decide, I'm here for you. You don't have to go through this alone. I nodded, grateful for his support, but it did little to ease the storm raging inside me. Thanks, man, I just need some time to think. Daniel squeezed my shoulder before stepping back. Take all the time you need, just know I've got your back, no matter what. He left me standing there under the oak tree, the night pressing in around me. I watched him walk away, his figure growing smaller until it disappeared into the shadows. Alone again, I turned my gaze to the sky, the stars cold and distant. I stayed there for what felt like hours, my mind turning over everything that had happened. The memories of Sarah and me together, our life before all of this, felt tainted now, as if they belonged to someone else. The woman I loved had become a stranger, and I didn't know if I could ever see her the same way again. Eventually, the cold drove me back inside. The halls of the estate were quiet now, most of the guests having retired for the night. I made my way back to our suite, my steps slow, heavy with the weight of the decision that loomed before me. When I opened the door, Sarah was sitting on the edge of the bed, her face streaked with tears, eyes red and swollen. She looked up as I entered, her expression a mix of fear and hope. Are you going to leave me? She asked, her voice small, trembling. I didn't answer right away, just stared at her, the silence stretching between us. Part of me wanted to say yes, to walk out and never look back, but another part of me, the part that still remembered the good times, the love we had shared, hesitated. I don't know, I finally said, the words heavy with truth, I just don't know. She broke down then, sobs racking her body as she buried her face in her hands. I watched her, feeling a strange mix of pity and anger. This was the woman I had vowed to spend my life with, the woman who had now shattered that life. I turned away, unable to watch her any longer. I needed to think, to figure out what I was going to do next. But one thing was clear, nothing would ever be the same again. The betrayal had changed everything, and there was no going back. The next morning I woke before dawn, the weight of the previous night's revelations pressing down on me like a heavy stone. Sarah was still asleep, her breathing soft and even, as if nothing had changed. I watched her for a moment, feeling a cold detachment settle in my chest. The woman lying beside me wasn't the Sarah I had married, the Sarah I had trusted. She was someone else, someone who had betrayed me in the most personal way. I slipped out of bed quietly, careful not to wake her, and left the room. My mind was sharp now, the fog of shock and confusion from the night before replaced by something darker, something resolute. I knew what I had to do. In the hallway, I took out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the name I was looking for, Jackson. We'd gone to college together, and while I had taken the straight and narrow path, Jackson had built a career on the fringes of legality, dealing in information and favors that most people didn't want to acknowledge existed. We'd kept in touch over the years, mostly on a friendly basis, but now I needed his expertise. I stepped outside into the early morning chill and made the call. Jackson answered on the second ring, his voice groggy but alert. David. What's going on, man? It's early. I need a favor, I said, cutting straight to the point. A big one. There was a pause on the other end as he processed the seriousness in my tone. What kind of favor? Information, I replied, on a guy named Richard Drake. And I need to set up something that'll make him and someone else pay for what they've done. Jackson's voice hardened. What happened? I told him everything about Sarah, about Richard, about what I'd seen. The words came out cold and steady, devoid of the emotion that had gripped me the night before. This was business now, pure and simple. When I finished, Jackson let out a low whistle. That's messed up, man. But if you want to go down this road, I can help. You sure about this? I've never been more sure of anything in my life, I replied, the steel in my voice leaving no room for doubt. All right, Jackson said, give me some time. I'll dig up everything I can on Drake and I'll make sure it's enough to ruin him. As for your wife, I'll set things in motion. She won't know what hit her. I thanked him and ended the call, my mind already spinning with the possibilities. If Sarah and Richard thought they could betray me and get away with it, they were in for a rude awakening. This wasn't going to end with tears and apologies. It was going to end with them both paying dearly for what they had done. Over the next few days, I played the part of the devastated husband, giving Sarah just enough hope that maybe, just maybe, we could salvage something from the wreckage of our marriage. She was cautious, careful not to push me too far, but I could see the relief in her eyes every time I didn't bring up Richard. She thought she was getting away with it, that her tears and remorse were enough to smooth things over. She was wrong. Jackson worked quickly, and within a week, I had everything I needed. Richard Drake, it turned out, had more skeletons in his closet than just his affair with my wife. Shady business deals, illegal financial schemes, and connections to some less than savory characters, all of it documented and ready to be exposed at the right moment. But that wasn't enough. Richard needed to feel the sting of betrayal just as I had. So I set up a meeting between him and a business associate, someone who promised a lucrative deal but who was, in reality, one of Jackson's contacts. The deal was a trap, designed to pull Richard in and expose him at the worst possible time with everything he had on the line. As for Sarah, I began laying the groundwork for her downfall. It started small misplaced items, strange calls, and emails that she couldn't remember sending. She began to doubt herself, questioning her memory, her sanity. I made sure to be supportive, comforting her when she was on the verge of breaking down, all the while stoking the fires of her paranoia. Then came the financial hits. I had been careful to keep our finances separate, but now I began to withdraw large sums of money from our joint accounts, moving them to an offshore account that Sarah had no access to. I canceled her credit cards, citing fraud concerns, and arranged for her to be audited by the IRS, using some of the evidence Jackson had dug up on her recent spending habits. It didn't take long for the cracks to show. Sarah grew more frantic, her anxiety spilling over into every aspect of her life. She lost weight, couldn't sleep, and began snapping at everyone around her. I made sure to be there, playing the role of the concerned husband, even as I tightened the noose around her neck. The final blow came when I set up a meeting between her and Richard, using a burner phone to send her a message from him. She thought she was going to see him to discuss their future, but instead she walked into a carefully orchestrated sting, where she found herself face to face with a private investigator I had hired to document everything. Her affair was exposed in the most public way possible. Pictures, videos, and incriminating texts were all laid bare, and by the time it was over, she was left with nothing, no reputation, no money, no future. Richard, too, found his world crumbling as his deals fell apart, his assets frozen, and his dirty secrets broadcast for all to see. When it was done, I stood back and watched as the life they had tried to build together went up in flames. They had wanted to betray me, to ruin everything I had built, but in the end, it was they who were left broken. I felt no remorse, no guilt. They had made their choices, and they had paid the price. As I walked away from the wreckage, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. The woman I had loved was gone, but so was the man who had been betrayed. In his place was someone new, someone who had taken control and exacted the justice that was due. The days that followed were a blur of cold, calculated moves. Sarah's life unraveled with a speed that would have been alarming if it wasn't exactly what I had planned. The carefully laid traps snapped shut one by one, leaving her floundering in a mess she couldn't escape. It started with the phone call from the IRS. I watched as Sarah's face drained of color when she answered the phone, the agent on the other end informing her that she was under investigation for tax evasion. The funds she thought were secure in our joint accounts had been traced, flagged as suspicious transactions that didn't align with her declared income. I pretended to be shocked, concerned, even offering to help her sort it out. But inside I was cold, detached, watching the walls close in on her. Then came the foreclosure notice. I had moved the mortgage payments to an account she had no access to, letting them go unpaid for months. She hadn't noticed, too caught up in her own drama with Richard to pay attention to the finances. When the letter arrived, she panicked, frantically calling the bank, only to be told that the house was now in arrears and on the brink of repossession. I watched her grow more frantic with each passing day, her once vibrant energy now reduced to a pale shadow of desperation. She hardly slept, dark circles forming under her eyes, her movements jittery, nervous. She was unraveling, exactly as I had intended. Richard, for his part, had been thoroughly dealt with. The fake business deal orchestrated by Jackson had gone off without a hitch. Richard had walked into it with the confidence of a man who believed he was untouchable. By the time he realized he was being set up, it was too late. His assets were frozen, his reputation in tatters. The illegal deals and shady connections were brought to light, and he was left scrambling to cover his tracks as everything he had worked for crumbled around him. The final nail in the coffin came when I had Jackson leak the details of Richard's affair with Sarah to the press. Photos, text messages, and recordings, all of it was laid bare for the world to see. The media pounced on the scandal, tearing Richard apart in the court of public opinion. He was finished, his career, his reputation, everything gone in an instant. As for Sarah, the public exposure of her affair was the last straw. Whatever friends she had left turned their backs on her, unwilling to be associated with the scandal. Her social circles evaporated overnight, leaving her isolated and alone. She tried reaching out to me, her voice trembling with fear and desperation, but I was done playing the concerned husband. I told her we were finished, that she had made her bed, and now she had to lie in it. The divorce papers were served the next day, ironclad with every clause and provision designed to strip her of anything she might have hoped to hold on to. The prenuptial agreement she had once scoffed at now worked entirely in my favor. With the evidence of her infidelity, she had no legal standing to contest the terms. She would walk away with nothing, and she knew it. She tried to fight it, of course, but her lawyer must have told her what she already knew deep down, that she had no leg to stand on. In the end, she signed the papers with trembling hands, her once proud and defiant demeanor completely shattered. The house, the accounts, the assets, everything stayed with me. The last time I saw her was on the day she came to collect her things. I watched from the upstairs window as she loaded her belongings into the back of a beaten-up sedan she had managed to scrape together enough money to buy. She looked up at the house one last time, her eyes empty, devoid of the spark they once held. As she drove away, I felt nothing. No remorse, no pity. Just a cold satisfaction that justice had been served. She had chosen her path, and I had merely ensured she walked it to its bitter end. The aftermath was quiet. Richard's downfall was swift and brutal, and the man who had once been a formidable figure in his world was now a pariah, disgraced and financially ruined. I heard through the grapevine that he had fled the city, his tail between his legs, but I didn't care enough to find out where he had gone. He was finished, and that was all that mattered. As for me, life moved on. The house was mine, free and clear, a tangible reminder of what I had built and fought to keep. The money that had once been tied up in joint accounts was now securely in my control, untouched by Sarah's grasping hands. I kept a small circle of friends, those who had stood by me through it all, and I made a point to keep my life simple, free from the complications that had once threatened to destroy me. But there was something more, something I hadn't expected. As the dust settled and the adrenaline of revenge began to fade, I found myself in a place of quiet contentment. The anger that had fueled my actions was gone, replaced by a calm resolve. I had faced the worst kind of betrayal, and I had come out the other side stronger, more focused, and in control of my own destiny. There were no more secrets, no more lies, just a clear path forward, unburdened by the past. And as I stood in the doorway of the house that was now entirely mine, I realized that the peace I felt was the truest form of revenge, the kind that came not from destroying others, but from reclaiming my life and building it anew. In the end, the karmic scales had balanced, and I was content to let them rest. The woman who had betrayed me was gone, her life in ruins. The man who had sought to steal from me was broken, and I, the betrayed husband, had emerged from the storm with everything I needed and nothing left to fear. A year passed after the divorce papers were signed, a year in which I rebuilt my life from the ground up. The process wasn't easy. Untangling myself from a decade-long marriage was like peeling away layers of skin, each one more painful than the last. But with each step I felt the weight of the past lift, replaced by something lighter, something freer. The house was quieter now, but I found peace in the solitude. I took up hobbies I had long neglected: woodworking, fishing, things that allowed my mind to focus on the present instead of the wounds of the past. My days were simple, structured, with none of the chaos that had once defined my life with Sarah. It was during one of those quiet mornings, sipping coffee on the back porch, that I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. The anger, the betrayal, the revenge, it all seemed like a distant memory now, something that had happened to someone else. I had moved on, and with that, the urge for vengeance had finally faded into the background. The divorce had been finalized quickly thanks to the ironclad prenuptial agreement. Sarah didn't fight it, probably realizing that any attempt to contest the terms would only prolong her suffering. She walked away with nothing but her personal belongings, while I kept everything else: our home, our savings, the life we had once built together. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she had left town shortly after the divorce, moving in with a distant relative in another state. No one really knew what had become of her, and I didn't care enough to find out. The chapter of my life with her was closed, and I had no intention of reopening it. As for Richard, the man who had thought he could steal my wife and get away with it, his fall from grace was as spectacular as it was swift. The deals he had relied on to maintain his lavish lifestyle collapsed, and his reputation was permanently tarnished. Last I heard, he was living in a run-down apartment somewhere on the outskirts of town, a shadow of the man he had once been. No one in our circles talked about him anymore. He was a ghost, forgotten and irrelevant. But the most interesting piece of information came months after the dust had settled. A private investigator I had hired to gather dirt on Richard had uncovered something I hadn't expected. Richard had a history of doing this, of seducing women who were married, engaged, or otherwise committed, just for the thrill of it. He thrived on the power and control he could exert over them, the way he could manipulate them into betraying the people they loved. In the end, though, it was his undoing. One of his previous targets had been a woman married to a powerful man, a man who didn't take kindly to Richard's games. When the scandal broke, that man used every resource at his disposal to ensure Richard's downfall. It was poetic justice, in a way, that the very thing Richard had used to destroy others was what eventually destroyed him. As I sat on the porch, watching the sun rise over the horizon, I couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. The revenge had been satisfying, but it was the life I had rebuilt that brought me true peace. The past was behind me, and for the first time in a long while I looked to the future with a sense of hope. I had learned a lot through the ordeal about trust, about betrayal, and about the lengths people will go to for power and control, but I had also learned about resilience, about the strength it takes to pull yourself out of the darkness and into the light. I wasn't the same man I had been before Sarah's betrayal, and for that I was grateful.